Okay, so I'm Carlos Chacon, right, managing partner of SQL Data Partners. Right, we're here with Eugene Meininger today. Looking forward to his session. And we want to thank you for attending our seasonal series of the Power BI. So this is the first session of 3 we have planned about Power BI. So this is, if you're familiar with our SQL Trail events, this is different. This is much shorter than our traditional events are. So let's see. So the seasonal series attempts to provide smaller sessions more frequently over a specific topic. And with that, thank you everyone for your patience. And let me turn the time over to Eugene.
Yeah, awesome. Let's see.
Welcome,
Share.
sir.
Let's see how this handles this. Aha. All right. So real quick about me, I'm a business intelligence consultant. So I get paid to help people make reports and understand how their data works. I'm also a Pluralsight author, and so I make courses on Power BI, on streaming data, and occasionally some weird stuff. So I've got one on Jaspersoft reporting, which I describe as SQL Server reporting services if it was written in Java 2 decades ago, which is not a compliment. And then I'm the other host on the SQL Data Partners podcast. So what are we going to talk about over the next 30 some minutes? Well, I want to cover just at a high level, who uses Power BI? What was it created for? And what is Power BI, right? So the idea is that by the end of this talk, you're going to at least have an idea of the contours of what Power BI is and where it fits, right? You're not going to be able to tell me all the different, let's say we're talking about cars, you're not going to be able to tell me all the different makes and models and maybe the difference between, a Ford Fiesta and a Ford Fusion, but you're going to have a pretty good idea that you don't want to drive a car into the water, right? That you want a boat for that. So at the very least, it's going to help you understand whether Power BI is a boat or a car or a plane or what have you. And then we'll have time for questions and hopefully get an idea of what you would want to see in the next 2 of these. So I have a certain idea of what to cover, but it may be that a lot of people are stuck on licensing or how to make use of their visualizations or what have you. So what is Power BI for? Who is Power BI for? So Power BI was designed for business users first. And you see that a lot when you look at the features that come out of Microsoft, because so often it feels like they're reinventing the wheel. And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way, but more in the sense that they've taken things like data cleansing, data modeling, data warehouses, and said, well, how do we make it so that Chris in accounting is able to create value? Because in my mind, sometimes the term business user is said with a little bit of derision or looking down at folks, especially, if you're a little bit too deep in the tech world. But the term I like to use is domain experts. The people closest to the business have a domain expertise that is valuable. And if we can allow them to take advantage of that, that's a big deal. I learned this lesson personally this year when I had to do my business taxes. So I have a small LLC, and I had to reconcile my books. And I hadn't done that for the 2 years that I was around. And I was pulling my hair out in QuickBooks because I didn't understand the whole double-sided general ledger sort of deal. And I would get paid for an invoice, and it would show up on my deposits, but I would also mark it as paid, and that created 2 entries. And so QuickBooks said I made twice as much money as I actually did, and I did not want the IRS taking twice as much money as they were actually supposed to. And if I had been an accountant, or if I'd had these years of experience with accounting with the business, wouldn't have been such a frustration. So Microsoft designed Power BI for business users first, but there's not just one type of user. In my mind, there's 3 broad buckets of the types of folks that interact with Power BI. And in my mind, it forms a spectrum of user engagement. And Power BI has features to support every step along the way. So the first one is the report consumer, right? In the kind of how an iPad is a consumer device kind of sense, where they're not producing anything, they're just making use of the reports, right? I remember when I was working years ago with SRS, I was interested in like, oh, we can add parameters and we can let people modify this stuff and make changes and do all these things. And, when I asked them, like, hey, is that what you is that what you want? A lot of them are like, no, can you just send it to me in an email on a schedule? Which you could, but there wasn't a lot of engagement. Um, and so for these folks, the starting point, some of the benefits and capabilities that Power BI has is first, it has easy sharing, right? You can just share a link for a report for a dashboard, um, and they can view the report. You can give them access to the workspace. They can access everything in there. Or this next bullet point, you can create Power BI applications. Now, I don't like the term application because that implies a certain amount of button pressing and interactivity and saving data and all this stuff that isn't 100% there with Power BI. You can simulate pieces of it. I like to think of Power BI apps as much more of just a package, right? It's a collection of reports with a little bow put on top, but it's really, really good as a way to distribute canonical, endorsed, verified reports, right? And you say, okay, these are the finance reports. And then finally, there's support for data refresh with on-premises data sources as well as cloud ones. And this is really beneficial for consumers because you've got options as you decide, okay, do we just need nightly imports, hourly, sub-hourly? And a lot of times the data still lives on premises, but Power BI, 90% of the time, lives in the cloud. And there's ways to bridge the two that's pretty much transparent to the user, which is really great. Next, we have report explorers. So these people still may not be creating reports, but they're willing to explore. They're willing to click around, dig a little bit deeper. And so some of the features that support them is there's a filter pane. And so you can have a set of filters available and they can pick region, they can pick time, date range. They can look at category, if they're looking at employees, they can look at boss, all that kind of stuff. You have support for bookmarks, which are a filter bookmark or a bookmark for a set of filters. So you might have it so it's like, okay, I have this report, but most of the time I care about my department and the past 3 months. And so I want a button where I can just go to those filters. That's functionality that's built in there. And so you can take a single report that has a bunch of flexibility behind the scenes, and a user can pick the views she or he wants and save those, which is really cool. And then there's drill downs and drill throughs, which are functionality with visuals that allows you to take a certain subset of the data, say a bar and a bar chart, and go deeper and see some more of the detail, usually at a finer level of granularity or filtered to that information. Finally, the third category is the report creator. These are the folks who have said, you know what, this data is useful, this report's useful, but I want to put my own spin on it, right? And for that, Power BI supports GUI data prep, so a graphical user interface for taking data that's a mess. If you're living out of Excel and flat files and all this kind of stuff, it can take that and allow you to click some buttons and create what I like to think of as almost like a macro language for cleaning up your data. And that process then, just like a macro, can be run on demand. There's DAX formulas, which allow for data modeling. Specifically, I want to aggregate this data. I want to filter this data. You can imagine you want to be able to do a year-over-year analysis, right? Well, you can write all that logic in this formula language that has a lot of similarities to the Excel formula language. And then finally, the actual report creation is drag and drop. It has some similarities to working with PowerPoint or other Office products. And so all of these things means that the barrier to entry is a lot lower. Now, we'll talk at the end when we talk about cons. That doesn't always mean the learning curve is lower, right? So it's easy to get started, but it's also, in some cases, when you're dealing with DAX especially, it can be easy to get lost in the woods. But Power BI was designed to support this whole spectrum of user engagement. But it didn't quite start out this way. What Power BI was about 5 or 6 years ago, well, longer actually, probably closer to 10, depending on when you count, is it was born in Excel. So it's been so long, I forget the exact timeline, but for Excel 2010, there was a plugin called Power Query. Now, I forget if it exactly came out in like 2010, 2011, but I know for sure it was available for 2010 because I've written code back for 2010 for Power Query and Power Pivot. And so Power Query was this tool for creating that reproducible data cleansing. And then Power Pivot was a really revolutionary tool that allows you on consumer hardware with 4 gigs of RAM to have millions of rows in your Excel file. And I remember when I was young, I think we were learning about Excel in like 8th grade, um, finding out about they had increased the number of rows you could have in Excel from like 65,000 to a million. I'm like, who's going to ever put a million rows in Excel? It's like, turns out people do that. But Power Pivot is based on a columnar database. And so what that means, that has really, really good compression, even if you have a column consisting of a million data points. Then you had Power View, which was this visualization engine, and it looked kind of neat, but it died an ignoble death because of Steve Jobs. Because Steve Jobs, he created the iPhone. He said, you know what? Flash is bloatware, and we're not going to support it on the iPhone. And along with that, we lost Silverlight from Microsoft, which was a similar piece of tooling, which Power View was based on. And then there was Power Maps, which was just 3D maps, and it didn't really cohere with the other toolings, but these were all Power BI at the time. But at that point in time, it was literally just someone in Microsoft marketing saying, well, power is good, so we're going to put the word in front of it, right? You could connect them, you could have the data flow from one stage to the next, but they were separate products. Today, though, we have a single product available called Power BI. And so what I think of as Power BI 2.0 is a couple things. First, it's a desktop authoring tool. So what you see here is Power BI desktop. And here's a sample report from Microsoft, and it gives you an idea of some of the things that you can do with it. And then once you've authored the reports, you're not going to read them in here. You could, and people do that to get around licensing issues, but I wouldn't recommend it. Instead, you're going to publish them to the Power BI service, which is powerbi.com. Now, let's walk through in a little bit more detail those different layers of Power BI. So, quick analogy, let's talk about cooking. So me and my spouse are subscribed to a meal kit, and I get called the sous chef. Well, no, I imagine getting called the sous chef. My spouse has never actually uttered those words, but I call myself the sous chef because um, I do some of the food purchasing, but I do a lot of the prep, right? Because I don't care about cooking. Like I enjoy it to some degree, but I enjoy eating more. And so I usually get tasked with cutting up vegetables and zesting lemons, which was a verb that I did not know until I got married, and, mixing things up and all this kind of stuff. So steps that you might do no matter what you're cooking, right? If you're cooking a broccoli stew or broccoli salad or teriyaki or something like that, you still have to wash and cut up the broccoli no matter what, right? But then once you have the ingredients ready, then you actually combine and cook them. And that combination of ingredients determines the end result. It determines what you're actually making. And then if you're at a fancy restaurant, There's the whole plating piece. Now here we have a bunch of Fiesta ware that we got when we got married, and it's bright and colorful. But I like to joke that you can tell how expensive a restaurant is by how non-circular the plates are, right? If you've got like a square plate with squiggles around the side, it's going to be $100 for the meal. And then finally, you have to eat somewhere. And so a lot of times you might go to a restaurant because you like the ambiance or you're sick of eating at home or whatever. So why why do I say all this? Because clearly you did not come here to learn about cooking from someone who doesn't like to cook. Well, when we talk about the layers of Power BI, first we have the data preparation. The data is oftentimes it's not in the shape that we want it. Data might be pivoted where each column represents a month's worth of data. Data might have missing values. Data might have incorrect values. It might need to be flattened together because when you're dealing with transactional databases, a lot of times the data is in a bunch of little tables because folks don't want to or have duplicate information. But for reporting, sometimes you do want a certain amount of duplicate information. Once you've prepared the data in a way that anyone could use, no matter what report they're creating, for the most part, then you have the data modeling. That's when you take the separate ingredients and you combine them together. And so you do joins, or with DAX, you're going to do what's called relationships. And you're going to say, okay, this table relates to this table based on this key. It's very similar to a join, but it doesn't pre-compute the end result. Next, you have the data visualization, right? Are your plates square or circle or curvy, or are you using a pie chart and you're going to get tomatoes thrown at you by the people in the data visualization community? And you have to think about, well, what's going to be the most effective way to represent the data? Because one of the anti-patterns that I see when working with customers is white space is a bad thing. They try to shove as much information on the screen as possible, where a lot of times you want to work in such a way that you can scan, right? So you have the most important things, the KPIs up top. You can get the top level information, then drill down, either just by looking down or by taking advantage of things like cross-filtering and drill throughs and all these sorts of things. And then finally, the restaurant is report sharing. So like I said, 90% of the time, your reports are going to live on powerbi.com, on the Power BI service. There is a Power BI report server for folks that can't go to the cloud, but these are kind of the four big components when it comes to Power BI. And specifically how they match up, we've got Power Query for the data cleansing, DAX and what used to be Power Pivot, which is still in Excel today, for the data modeling, HTML5 and JavaScript for the visualizations, and again, for the hosting is powerbi.com. So that's a high-level overview. Another thing about Power BI is it was designed for self-service. So what is self-service business intelligence? If I give you a link to a report and you click the link, have you served that yourself, right? Probably not, right? I think of two things when I think of self-service. One is self-service haircuts. I measured the duration of the pandemic by how many haircuts I gave myself, and it was 3, and that was 3 too many, right? And I finally got a chance to pay someone else to give me a haircut. At the same time, I remember when I was real young, we drove through New Jersey, and I was shocked that some other person was putting gas in our car. And even as I grew older, it didn't make sense to me, right? We have a full service gas station here in Pennsylvania, about 5 miles away from me, and I don't know why it exists. Like, are there folks that just really hate pumping gas? I don't know. But to me, just clicking on a report link doesn't feel like self-service. Now, what if the user is that report explorer and they're starting to apply filters and dig around the data? Maybe. What if they're exporting data so they can look at it in Excel? May not be what we want, but that starts to feel like self-service. What if they're modeling the data? What if they're creating visualizations? Well, to me, self-service business intelligence is creating business meaning without needing IT help. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you just kick IT out the door, give them all pink slips or anything, right? Like I like to get paid and pay the mortgage. But there is, you know, some room for not needing IT help. You may have IT set up the data model. You may have them set up the infrastructure, but then still have the ability to create your own reports, or to the very least, explore those reports. And so again, like I said before, there's these three buckets I think of when I think of users. There's the report consumer, explorer, and creator. And the key part I want you to get with this is that as we go along, we see increasing need for self-service. And what's really great about Power BI is it's designed to support users all along that spectrum. So the question is, which is it, right? What do you want? Well, again, you can have a fully centralized approach if you're dealing with Power BI. You can endorse data sets. You can create Power BI apps that can't be modified by the consumers. You can limit access and people's abilities to work with Power BI. So why would you do this? Well, if you're in a heavily regulated environment, it can be essential. I remember doing work for a Fortune 1000 company, and the people who developed the reports were not allowed to publish them because they were dealing with the internal finances of the company. It was publicly traded, and so that was a no-no. There had to be a separation between the people who created the reports and people who deployed it. And so you can imagine a situation where you don't want folks creating their own reports with financial data. You can have a hybrid approach, right? You can have it so that the people you can have it so IT manages certain data sets, certain data models, marks them as validated or endorsed within the infrastructure. They can create reports and endorse them within the infrastructure, but then people can still have their own sandboxes, create their own reports, and you have a hybrid approach. Or you can do entirely self-service. And sometimes this is necessary. Sometimes this is a requirement, because I've done work where, the people requesting the work had no trust in IT. I've had work where it was one guy by himself who was analyzing telecoms data as a consultant. He would basically help companies find where their call center's time was going and where they could save costs. And so there's a whole spectrum there that's available. So I kind of want to sum up a little bit with some benefits, some cons, and just the gist in my mind of Power BI, and then we have some time for questions here. So benefits. When would I recommend Power BI? So the first thing is the low entry cost. I remember seeing on Twitter a friend who, I believe he went from MVP to just start working for Microsoft, and the other person was joking that he was going to go work for Domo, and the person it responded like, Domo has such great pricing, you can't even tell what it is, or something like that, where you go to their site and they're like, well, we charge based on usage and needs and all this kind of stuff. With Microsoft, it starts out at $10 per user per month. And you just know that, right? It gets more complicated when you get to the higher sizes or larger workloads, but starting out, $10 per user per month. And this is for people both creating and consuming reports. There's no separation in licenses there until you get up to like 500 users or something like that. And so that's one of the nice things, is that you can start a pilot project and say, we're just going to license these 5 folks and give them this one report project and see what they're able to do. If it doesn't work, you shut it all down. You haven't paid $30,000 for a click report server or something like that. So I think that's a really huge benefit, is just low entry cost and simple licensing when you start out. Another is the use of specialized tools, which is also a negative, I'll be honest, in the fact that Power Query and DAX are really, really good at what they do. They're not like SQL, which is much more of a generalized querying language that can do a lot of things, but not any particular thing super amazing aside from actual querying, so just basic data retrieval, right? Instead, Power Query is just phenomenal at taking things that you might do in Excel by hand or pay an intern, minimum wage or something to do. It's really good at the things that are tedious and time consuming and automating those. And honestly, I wish it was available in more places. So it's available in Power BI. You can use it in Power Automate if you're pulling from SQL Server. You can use it in SSAS. You can use it in Azure Data Factory. So they are expanding where you can use it, but I would love to see it for being able to pull data into Access. I know people think Access is dead, but I'm doing a project where I'm doing some support for Access. I'd love to see it for pulling data into SQL Server, right? Because it's so intuitive for a lot of the basic stuff, and it works really well with things like XML and JSON. And then DAX has a bit of a learning curve, but man, whenever you want to be able to show like a year-over-year analysis or a slice of pie analysis, or you want to do like a running total or whatever, you end up with some really simple, clean code. So specialized tools can be a real benefit. Next, like I said, it supports a variety of users, right? While it was designed originally for business users, it makes sense for business intelligence developers. It makes sense for being consumed by C-suite executives. Um, it it supports a pretty large range of users. It even has the capability of being embedded into commercial applications, and we've done work on that before. And then finally, like I talked about, it supports a range of centralization or decentralization. And I think that is reflective of how a lot of modern projects work because the ideal is something that's scoped and planned and managed, but we're not in the 80s anymore where we have to spend $1 million to create a data warehouse to even start something, right? You can get proof of concepts done really quickly, and I think there's a benefit in that to establish value. So what are some of the downsides? So a couple things is it's focused very heavily on analytical interactive reports. If your report is never going to involve a user clicking on it, Power BI is probably not the right tool. If it's something that you want to print out, that you just want to put in a PowerPoint or what have you, Power BI is probably not the right tool for you. Instead, it's very, very good at, okay, we have 10 years worth of data and we want to see how things have been trending over those 10 years. We want to see how are we doing this year in terms of sales compared to last year. It's very good at, okay, I have all this data. I'm looking at total sales, but I want to drill down to a specific region, a specific department, what have you. Downside is specialized tools. And what I mean by that is I see folks get stuck whenever they need to do something particularly advanced with Power Query, because now you're having to look at M code, which can be a bit intimidating, or with DAX. I was talking to someone yesterday, a customer yesterday, about how I'm at the point where I'm trying to learn Spanish and I know just enough words that I have to do daily maintenance with flashcards and things. And I can pick out words from sentences, but not enough to always get the whole sentence, right? I'm at that point in fluency where I either have to like just make this month-long push or just keep making this grinding, plodding progress. And that's how it feels with DAX sometimes, where, okay, you figure out how to use a calculate function, you figure out how to do your basic sums, but then you run into a bug and you're like, I don't know what's going on, right? I was joking that in Spanish, you can say that your father's a certain number of years old. Mi papa tiene 15 años or something. We've got at least one Spanish speaker who's going to tell me I did it wrong, but if you don't have the little diacritic marks, you might say, okay, my potato has this many butts instead. So you have to be careful with that. And that's how it feels when you're working with DAX with these specialized tools sometimes. The third downside is that it encourages a lack of planning. And I've just seen this over and over again where it's really great for those proof of concepts. It's really great for getting things off the ground. But so often I see people, they just dive in and they don't think, well, how are we going to be using this in 3 years? What are the performance considerations? how can we make it so this data model is reusable for other people instead of, being overly specific with their specific report. I remember my last job, I wrote SQL views for a set of reports, and I named the views after the person that was asking for them, which in retrospect was just the silliest thing ever to have Mark's schedule board view or something, because Mark left, and that was just a weird name, right? And while I don't ever see anything that extreme, I do see a lack of planning a lot of times. And then finally, while the licensing starts out simple, trying to enumerate all the different options and the cost benefit, and also all the different ways you can deploy Power BI reports can get a little bit complicated. So in summary, Power BI is ideal for growing out your analytical reporting in an organic, almost spiral kind of fashion. Oh, all right. So does anyone have any questions? We hit 30 minutes exactly.
Hey, Gene.
Yeah.
So Alan had a comment. You were talking about versions and whatnot. So he was asking about free, right? So he's the poor home user and wants to know how he can start using Power BI.
So home as in like Office 365 home, or just for his own personal usage?
Well, yeah. So I guess he's saying personal use.
Sure.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Alan,
no, I
I
can.
put you up on stage, and I'm not seeing that option now.
All right. Well, I can still answer the question. So,
Yeah.
that is a great question. So first off, Power BI desktop is 100% free. They're never going to charge you to use it, because they understand that that's not where people are generally going to consume the reports. So you can start writing reports today for free, no charge. You can also create a free powerbi.com account. And for the longest time, they didn't allow personal email addresses. I don't think that's changed, but I haven't looked in the past year or so. But it used to be they're like, this is for business purposes only. So if you try to sign up with your Gmail account, like, no, 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 no. I get around that by having my own domain. So if you need Alan at eugenemeidinger.com, just let me know and I'll hook you up. But so you can create a free account. The downside, the limitation is the moment you want to share that data with someone else in a secure private way, you need to pay it for a license. That's basically what it comes down to. You can do publish to web, but then in theory, anyone with that URL can access all of your data in that report. But for learning purposes, for personal purposes, you can start with Power BI Desktop. You can use the free license, all that stuff.
So Kevin asks, what all rights to the server does Power BI require? And rights. I'm thinking that he writes it as WRIT, like writing, but I'm.
Yeah. So well, I'll answer both questions and we'll see. Okay. So well, yeah. So yeah. Power BI, I guess I'll answer a couple different questions because I think there's a couple different ways to kind of interpret this, right? So for basic reporting, Power BI doesn't make any changes to the source data. It doesn't write anything back, and for the most part, it doesn't have the ability to do so, right? And so you would need to give it a reader account. Now, what it's doing is it'll be importing a copy of the data, and you can actually generate data in PowerBI.com. So I see an example there for a calendar table. You can write Power Query code that will generate a calendar table and have that stored with PowerBI.com or wherever you're storing your data. If you use Power BI report server, that's also an option. When I was talking about how Power BI has this whole Power BI apps things, but it's not quite an app. What I meant by that is, when I think of like a true application, I think of the ability to write back. Like, let's say we find some data that's wrong. I want to go and I want to make a change to it. Now, there are ways to use Power Apps, which is a different product, in conjunction with Power BI for a situation like that, where you're looking at a report and you want to be able to clean up the data and do that kind of stuff. But generally, the overall structure is going to be that you connect to your data sources. Some of them might be files, some of them might be SQL Server, some of them might be in the cloud. It's going to read that data in import mode, with Power Query, make some modifications, and then it's going to compress that data in a columnar format with DAX and save it to the cloud, and then add some business rules and logic on top with DAX. And a lot of those, when you're talking about measures, are computed dynamically on the fly. So yeah, yeah. So there was another question about without a counter table doesn't work well, and that's if you're using any of their built-in date logic, right? So a lot of their built-in date logic assumes that you have a contiguous or uninterrupted list of dates. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. If not, might start to make a little bit more sense for an email or something like that, which I'd be happy to do. Houston had a question about what do I mean by canonical, and verified one version of truth, and that's generally what I mean by that. Where the thing you never want to have happen is you never want to have two reports bubble up to the CFO that have different amounts for sales, right? Like even off by a penny, even if it's just a rounding error, you just never want to have that, because there's a saying that if the man with two watches never knows what time it is, right? And so that's kind of the concern is there's certain types of reports where the challenge or risk, if they're wrong, is much higher. And sometimes what you really want is that hybrid approach where, okay, here's reports that the C-suite is going to see, so we have to make sure that we've actually gotten it approved and managed and verified. But then there's the stuff, I had a call a month ago with a woman who was working in HR and was just trying to do basic HR reports about vacation days and all this stuff. And for something like that, she's just trying to meet her needs and her team's needs. And so self-service makes a lot more sense. So that's a good question.
Okay. Well, thank you, Eugene. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We hope it was informational. And we'll talk to you next time.
All right.
SQL Data Partners.